You also heard that Josh had nicknames for people. So, Jonathan Winawer arrived at City College after I did, so he became known as Other Jonathan. But then, depending whom Josh was talking to first at any given time, I could become Other Jonathan. So we were both, and then someone became OJ, so we were both OJ. So I guess you're OJ1, because you were the first Other Jonathan. Jonathan Winawer.
Just for variety, he sometimes called me AJ, for Lothar Jonathan, because I had spent some time in Paris before joining him. Someone who knows that he's thanks, Jonathan, and the organizers for giving me a chance to share my thoughts. Josh was my first mentor and close friend. And preparing for today was hard because it was all about Josh. I wasn't working with him. And while I was getting organized, I realized, Shayin kind of pointed out to me, that I was having a Wallman-esque experience. And by that, I mean that I procrastinated. And then I brainstormed, and I wrote down every thought and memory I had my work, friendship with Josh. I went through our email correspondences, I reread the papers we published together. And then I had to go find a cafe by the ocean, Catherine Bay, and sit and drink a lot of espresso. And then I worried, I talked about topic X, I'll also have to talk about Y, and so on. And finally, there was the difficult but somewhat rewarding process of facing reality and assembling my thoughts as best I could. And even with Josh's output, prodigious output as a scientist, he sometimes struggled to finish things, especially when it was a deadline. And sometimes it was funny, but sometimes it caused anxiety, and he would point that out. And I thought that was helpful to hear from a mentor to a student. Now, meeting Josh was my reintroduction to science. I had gone to college with the intention of becoming a physicist, but somehow life got in the way, and I graduated with a degree in classics, Latin and Greek. And I went back to school, and on the recommendation of a mutual friend, I came to City College in Josh's lab, and I told him I wanted to study neuroscience. And he asked me what aspect, and actually I wasn't really sure. And I had read some big topic books for the public, like Stephen Pinker's The Language Instinct. And I told Josh I was interested in big questions. How does the brain produce perception, thought, and language? And Josh was polite, but I think he had some doubts. And he said he found big questions interesting too, but that in his experience it was sometimes easier and more satisfying to tackle narrower, more focused topics. And he asked if I'd ever worked in a lab. No. Did I like to tinker with things like cars or cameras or whatever? No. And then he told me a bit about the work in his lab and said when he meets a prospective student, he likes to give them a paper to read and discuss it together. And so here, why don't you take this home and come back in a few days? And I remember the paper. It was this one. And it's a new paper. We cited it several times over the years, but it's not an easy paper for a person thinking about maybe going into science and on their first day. And but I got accustomed to studying and reading ancient Greek. It would take about an hour to read a page. And I did my best. I put in some effort. I came back and met Josh a few days later, and I tried to summarize the paper for him as best I could. And he finally perked up a little bit. And he said, maybe I should rethink things. Maybe a background in classes is just the thing you need for doing biology. And so I joined the myopia team, first as a volunteer, and then a research assistant, and then I got a master's degree with Josh. And the basic idea of myopia, I'm just going to explain very briefly that the eye of most animals grows into focus, and it does so using vision. And I don't know if this works, but if you can demonstrate that in the lab, if you put a lens over the eye, When the focal point moves close or moves further, the eye grows to compensate for that so that the length of the eye matches the optics. And I read the background stuff, and I had a vague idea for an experiment. I said, why don't we make this more realistic? And let's get rid of all these lenses. This is supposed to simulate the experience of an animal blur. And why don't we try to control the environment of what the animal sees? And Josh said, well, that's a good idea, but try getting a chicken to sit down and read a book all day. That's so easy. And like a good mentor, he suggested I try that direction, but maybe do something simple. And he said, if these experiments work with just short periods of vision, then maybe later we can work out a way to manipulate the visual environment. So that's what I did. I started working with just short periods of vision and lenses. And about 4 years later, we got a paper out of it. My first paper with Josh, my first paper. And by then I had actually kind of graduated and moved on, even by the time we started writing. And I remember when we started writing, because it was in Katz's delicatessen, I had made a mistake of making a scientific assertion that I couldn't back up, which was that Katz's had the best pastrami sandwiches in New York. And Josh said I'm crazy. And he listed, I don't know, 5 or 6 places that he knew were better, even though half of them had been out of business for 20 years. But Katz's had good tables, so that worked. And the temporal studies were helpful because, at least in our way of thinking about things at that time, because we thought in normal development, the eye experiences blur in a very transient way. You look here, you look there, maybe something is defocused, something's in focus. And we thought that understanding the temporal patterns in animal studies would be helpful for thinking about human myopia. But the studies also gave us a tool to address other questions. Here's one example, led by Captain Shadowing, also known as Madam X. And Josh really liked the title of this paper. In a matter of minutes, the eye can know which way to grow. Reviewers tried to get us to change it. He was very insistent. And the basic idea was that it's hard to distinguish between different kinds of blur. If you look into a camera, you turn it, if it gets better, you keep turning, if it gets worse, you turn the other way. How about the eye and its growth? And does it use this kind of trial and error mechanism? And we could take advantage of these kind of brief periods to test that by putting on a lens on the eye for just a few minutes before it had time to grow and change its vision, and then keep it in total darkness and then see what happened. And the short answer is that the eye did know which way to grow. It didn't need feedback, and it just went ballistic in the right direction off the bat. And we thought that was interesting. One implication is that visually guided eye growth is pretty sophisticated because it's hard to tell the difference between different kinds of blur. So I left Josh's lab in 2001 to start a PhD at MIT. And MIT is a place where you'll occasionally run into someone with a competitive personality and a lot of self-confidence. And there's not really any better preparation for that than having spent several years with Josh, because in his own quiet way, he was really fiercely anti-authoritarian, and he poked fun at everyone and anything that took themselves too seriously. I remember this email he sent me. He read New York Times book review always. He said, I see from the New York Times that your man, Peter, become my man, has decided which of our many behaviors are innate and which are not. Private line to God, no doubt. According to the Times overstated, he was reasonably cautious. And he was playful, but he also didn't like it when people look for genes to answer questions without also trying to understand the biology and the processes and so on. And he hated the idea that you could say there's a gene for that and consider your explanation finished. So we, exchanged gossip emails like this, and we continued to work together. One thing we worked on was this review paper that David mentioned, talked about this morning. Josh asked me if I wanted to co-author a review paper, and I said, sure, seemed like a great opportunity. I had no idea what the hell I was getting into. And it took 3 years to write the paper, and when the editor of the journal started to doubt we would ever finish, Josh came up with this idea. Sent an email, Tom, I wonder if I might ask a favor which will facilitate the finishing of my embarrassingly overdue review. My co-author and I would like to get together to work on the review for a week away from our respective cities and obligations. Is it possible to have the use of an office and library privileges at the SOC for a week? If this is not convenient, don't worry. We can find another location, albeit probably not one impregnated with as many great past thoughts, or with as nice a lunch. So we went out to La Jolla, spent a week thinking about myopia, writing about it, staring out the windows at the hang gliders of the ocean, and enjoying the veranda. And in this paper, we wanted to do three things. One was a scholarly review of the literature. I'm going to skip that. Another goal was polemical. And in Josh's words, in his email to the editor on submitting it, he says we wanted to force medical types to think about myopia in the context of control mechanisms and homeostasis rather than as a disease. What he meant was something like this, that saying that myopia is heritable is not an explanation. What's inherited? A weak sclera, an interest in reading, and those things wouldn't really be acceptable explanations either. He said myopia is not caused by bad genes or weak scleras or too much nearby. The growth of the eye, like that of other organs, is under homeostatic control. The puzzle is, what are the controlling variables? And what is the progressive myopic eye trying to balance? In these pictures, we spent months looking into other organs and systems and how they regulate their size, clownfish and pythons. It was fun and it was interesting, and mostly I think Josh wanted to frame myopia as a basic problem in biology rather than a clinical condition. Another goal was to propose a new idea, at least one in the paper, or if not a new idea, to reintroduce a forgotten one. And that idea was that myopic eyes have a different shape than non-myopic eyes, and that may be important. And I guess I won't explain the idea in detail, but the main point was that Josh thought, and that I wanted to emphasize the fact that we shouldn't just be looking here at the back of the eye where we have high acuity vision. We need to think about the whole eye and the whole system and what it's trying to balance. And in the years since then, I don't know if the idea is right, but there have been many more measurements and experiments dealing with refractive errors in the periphery than only in the fovea. And Josh wanted to accomplish something new, or at least push the field in the direction in doing this. And here's the reaction of the editor when we submitted the paper. So he basically liked it, but he said the only concern is with regard to length. The guidelines specify that a neuron review should be in the range of 45,000 characters. Your manuscript appeared to be over 130,000 characters. So after 3 years, it had to invest several more months of time and coffee and email and editing. And eventually, we got it short enough. So we finally wrote up all of the results that we had accumulated in my time in the lab, and so our work together ended. But we did continue a pretty much never-ending discussion, often but not always about science. That included me coming back to visit the lab. It included spending a lot of time together at the vision meetings in Florida, and sometimes driving from one side of Florida to the other, where Josh would insist on stopping every 15 minutes to look for birds, alligators in the Everglades. And he talked to me about pretty much everything that I was doing. He was always interested, unless it involved functional MRI. He was a little bit snobbish in his dislike for fMRI. But he could always be counted on for honest and creative feedback. And I talked to him about just about everything I did. And I'll just share one brief example to do with synesthesia, because Josh found this interesting. And I learned about the topic of synesthesia at City College when Josh invited the neuroscientist Rowan Chandra to give a colloquium on the topic. And in a nutshell, synesthesia is a kind of crosswiring of the senses that happens in a small percentage of the population. It's not a disorder. It does not interfere with normal life. Many famous people like Vladimir Nabokov have synesthesia. One form is colorography synesthesia, and the idea is that you see black text and it appears colored. So for one synesthete, an A might look red. For another synesthete, an A might look green. And kind of like myopia, synesthesia is thought to be inherited. It runs in families. And also like myopia, that can't be the whole explanation. The alphabet, for example, is not specified in the genes. And in one of the subjects that my friend Nathan and I studied, we noticed a pattern. Actually, it's this subject. If you rearrange the letters, you see this pattern. And there's got to be an explanation for that. And in this particular case, the person had a childhood toy with these same colors. And so there was something about her experience growing up that caused her to continue to see these colors as an adult. And we talked to Josh about this at length. He always had useful feedbacks and good ideas for experiments to test. What is the person really seeing? Is it a memory? Is it a perception? And so forth. And it didn't matter where Josh was when we emailed him. He might be in the lab. Or when I sent him this manuscript, he was in a cyber cafe in a nudist colony in Bordeaux. And he said, here I am. I just had lunch with Kevin O'Regan of the Grand Illusion article we discussed in Paris. I told him about your synesthesia experiment and encouraged you to contact him when we were in Paris in September. So he was always happy to keep up his friendship, stay in touch. I'm very happy about them, and I always appreciate that. My wife, Davy, and I were especially happy this October. I get emotional. It's the red-eye flight from California. Josh came to our wedding in October, and I think they enjoyed it. It was in an aquarium. Anyway, it looked happy. And I want to come back to where I started, which is this picture from Primorsky. It's a Ukrainian nightclub in Brighton Beach. Two things happened that night. First, it was my last day in the lab working with Josh. It also was the end of an absolutely brutal marathon attempt to do a grant renewal at the NIH. I'm sure you remember that. And the waiter took a bunch of pictures. They didn't come out that well. You can see Josh here staring into the distance. And John Choi, who's here somewhere today, had the idea that maybe he should switch places with the waiter. They got the waiter to go in the picture, and John took the photo. And everybody suddenly looked happy. And I thought that this was a moment that Josh must have enjoyed. It was a kind of slightly eccentric situation. It's the end of a lot of work. There were a bunch of friends and colleagues hanging out together, some live music, and then quite a lot of food and alcohol.